They thought they could control it. They thought nobody would notice. They thought the subpoenas would silence everyone, but now they're scrambling, pulling everything back before it's too late. Because something's coming, something they didn't see coming, and suddenly Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds are trying to vanish from a battle they started. The subpoenas, the threats, the legal pressure they thought would shut the internet up are now turning into something far worse for them: sanctions, media blowback, legal exposure, and a full creator revolt that won't be stopped by silence or spin. And now documents are being pulled, lawyers are going dark, creators are pushing back, and the court is paying attention. Something has shifted, and the fear behind the scenes is real because they know what's coming, Blake. Lively's legal team was confident until the subpoenas backfired, and it wasn't just about one creator anymore. It was about the entire platform, the voice of commentary, the power of exposure, and suddenly it wasn't just Blake and Ryan trying to win in silence. It was creators across the internet standing in defiance. The subpoenas were supposed to suppress that, but what happened next shocked even their closest advisors. The risk of sanctions, the risk of being exposed themselves, and now the panic is starting to show. They're trying to undo what can't be undone. And just when people thought this story was cooling down, the opposite happened. Legal insiders confirmed that not only were the subpoenas withdrawn, but they were pulled before any ruling was made, almost as if someone knew sanctions were about to land and they wanted out before things got worse too. Late, the backlash is already boiling over, and now legal commentators say this could be the beginning of a much bigger crisis for Blake Lively's team. Not just about bad PR, not just about YouTube backlash, but about the possibility that the legal system itself is about to respond. And if you think Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds can hide behind silence again, think again. This isn't 2018 anymore. The internet has changed, and every move is under a microscope. They're legal. Maneuvering might have worked behind closed doors once, but not now, not when documents are surfacing, not when creators are uniting, not when truth matters more than celebrity. And now they're scared, really scared, not just because of the public pressure, but because their entire strategy is falling apart. In real time, the subpoenas were their weapon. Now they've become the evidence, but it's not over, not even close. In fact, some would say this is where it really begins. And if you think creators are done speaking out, or that judges aren't watching closely, now you're mistaken. Something bigger is unfolding behind the scenes, and this is just the beginning. Stay tuned, because this story is about to explode in ways no one saw coming. They thought they could get away with it. They thought hiding behind lawyers and legalese would shield them from the consequences of their actions. But now the script has flipped. The very subpoenas they sent to silence the truth have been yanked back, not because they won, not because they settled, but because they're scared of what might come next, scared of who might finally speak, scared that this time the courtroom wouldn't protect them. It would expose them. Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the Hollywood power couple who once basked in endless praise, are now caught in a spiral of legal misfires and public distrust. It started quietly, when a few creators online began to question the timing, the wording, the pattern behind the subpoenas sent to YouTubers and commentators. Small voices, but loud enough to notice. Soon, it wasn't just questions being asked, it was connections being made. And when Candace Owens' name surfaced in the middle of this chaos, the noise reached an entirely different pitch, because this wasn't just about silencing critics anymore. It was about intimidation, strategy, manipulation, and possibly something darker. The internet exploded with theories, documents, interviews from people who'd received these sham subpoenas, and all signs pointed back to one source: a team backed by Blake and Ryan, or someone directly working for them. These weren't just any subpoenas. They carried an air of threat, vague language aimed to frighten, but no legal bite. A move that some experts labeled reckless, at best unethical, at worst. And now, in a sudden legal retreat, those same subpoenas have been retracted, withdrawn, before a judge could rule on whether they violated proper procedure or even crossed a legal line. And people began asking why. Why pull them now? Why not? Defend them in court? Why abandon a legal move you were supposedly confident in? And the answer became clearer by the day. Sanctions? The word kept floating through the legal discussions, sanctions for misuse of legal process for targeting creators, under false pretenses for manipulating the court system in a desperate attempt to regain control of a narrative slipping through their fingers. And if sanctions were even being considered, then pulling those subpoenas wouldn't save them. It would only confirm what many suspected all along, that the subpoenas weren't meant to protect. They were meant to punish, to intimidate, to pressure people into silence before too many others joined in. And Blake's team knows it. The internet knows it. And now the court may know it. To this sudden shift, the decision to pull back the documents came right as new filings hinted that a hearing could be called, not just to review the validity of the subpoenas, but to consider whether their issuance was done in bad faith. And that's where things get dangerous for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, because if bad faith is proven, if the court believes these subpoenas were weaponized to silence critics, not to protect legal interests, then they could face serious consequences, including financial penalties, public censure, and in the worst-case scenario, being barred from issuing similar legal threats again. This isn't just a PR mess, it's a legal time bomb, and every second they remain silent only confirms the fear behind the scenes, the fear that someone on their team overplayed their hand. And now the whole strategy is collapsing in front of the world. And then there's Candace Owens, who was once just a vocal figure on the sidelines, now reportedly preparing a move of her own. Sources close to this situation claim that Owens' legal team has been watching this subpoena scandal closely, analyzing the timing, the targets, the language, and determining whether this falls into a broader pattern of media intimidation. And if that's true, then what Blake and Ryan are facing now is just the surface. The bigger iceberg lies in potential countersuits or legal retaliation from people who were wrongly targeted. And that's the part their team never accounted for: creators who won't be silenced, lawyers who see an opening, and a legal system slowly waking up to the idea that Hollywood elites might be abusing process to protect image and crush dissent. And while Blake and Ryan retreat from the subpoena battlefield, the internet is only becoming more emboldened. Creators who were once quiet are speaking louder. Viewers are sharing receipts. Lawyers are stepping into comment sections to break down what just happened. And it's clear the old rules no longer apply. Fame no longer grants immunity. Not when digital footprints are forever. Not when people are documenting every step, every contradiction, every deletion. This isn't about cancel culture. This is about consequence culture. And for the first time in a long time, people aren't afraid to hold those at the top accountable. And the fact that the subpoenas were pulled before a hearing says more than any press release could. It says they were scared. Scared of what a judge might say, scared of what discovery might reveal, scared of how far this would spiral if they kept pushing, because subpoenas mean evidence, subpoenas mean testimony, and the last thing they wanted was for those conversations to be made public in court. That's what they feared the most. Not losing in court, but being exposed by it. And now that fear is guiding every step. Silence, retraction, containment, but none of it is working. The story has grown beyond their control. And now the narrative is being written by the very people they tried to suppress. And this is just part one of what could become the biggest legal unraveling of their careers. Because the court of law may move slowly, but the court of public opinion moves fast, and right now it's unforgiving. And just when the courtroom buzz seemed to settle, just when people thought they had seen the peak of the drama unfolding around Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, something even more unexpected happened. The subpoenas were gone suddenly, quietly, as if they had never been filed in the first place. There was no press conference, no grand announcement, no camera flashes capturing a team of lawyers storming out of the courthouse. Instead, what unfolded behind closed doors was a retreat, swift, strategic, and almost invisible at first, but not invisible enough to go unnoticed by those watching closely, those who had been following the events of this escalating conflict between Hollywood's golden couple and a growing number of creators, journalists, and observers started connecting the dots, the narrative that had been carefully built over months, perhaps longer, was beginning to show signs of cracks. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the legal papers that vanished. It was the tone, the posture, the entire rhythm of the fight itself. Ryan, who had always seemed cool under pressure, reportedly become more hands-on behind the scenes. Not on camera, not in interviews, but in the legal boardrooms and digital damage control teams. The same charm that made them darlings of Hollywood was now being scrutinized under a different kind of lens. People weren't asking who wore what or what film was coming next. They were asking questions about transparency, intent, and silence. That was growing louder by the day, and then came whispers about sanctions, the possibility that legal consequences could arise. It's not just for those who filed the subpoenas, but for the intent behind them. Because if a subpoena is issued with the purpose of silencing creators instead of gathering legitimate evidence, it crosses a line, a legal and ethical one, and multiple voices from the legal world began raising these very points. Not just content creators or commentators, but actual attorneys began to quietly question the justification behind the documents that had been sent to several online personalities. It wasn't just a YouTube issue anymore. It was becoming something far more complicated. Blake's legal team maintained a firm no comment response, which ironically only added to the growing curiosity, because sometimes saying nothing speaks volumes. Meanwhile, creators would initially stayed silent out of fear or uncertainty were beginning to speak, not in outrage, but in detail. They shared screenshots, emails, timelines. Many made efforts to keep their tone calm, measured, and focused, because this wasn't about canceling. It was about clarifying and protecting their right to speak freely within the bounds of the law. As more details emerged, it became clearer that the subpoenas may have had more to do with controlling a narrative than actually pursuing justice. And that's where the concern grew for many watching, especially those who rely on platforms like YouTube for their teen. It failed there, not computer for their teen. Emerged, it became for their unskicked tape, became to me a lot of new Selanes. My new Selaner with Concute. And that's what they secured with Selane. With Concute Salady, LFA qua concludi to see where I confide. Where we see so way, so we see to see, so way to see, with the when you see with sorry, with can you like a concor, I do we to get to me to we can eat a we cue to me with to me you can go on to the we could kick to cock we with you could kick the cafe will in you deck with I could do it to it can we take livelihoods. The power dynamic became starkly visible. What happens when people with immense reach and resources turn their attention toward independent creators? The worry wasn't just about one or two channels, it was about precedent and about whether these tools of legal pressure were being used ethically or merely strategically. Meanwhile, sources close to the courtroom proceedings shared that judges were also beginning to take notice, not because the headline said so, but because motions had been filed, requests had been made, counter-arguments were presented, and legal experts knew this was no longer a media spectacle. It had moved into the core of due process. The question looming now was not just about who did what, but whether the process had been misused in ways that would trigger judicial response. And if sanctions were indeed on the table, it meant serious implications, not just fines or fees, but reputational consequences for those who initiated the actions in questionable ways. In the background, supporters of open dialogue and creator rights began organizing, sharing resources, making videos that calmly broke down the legalese for wider audiences. A wave of transparency was rolling in, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore it with each passing day. Meanwhile, Blake and Ryan's public presence noticeably decreased. Fewer appearances, fewer posts. The calculated quietness spoke to many as either strategy or reflection, but to the growing audience following The case, it only confirmed that something significant was happening, something more than just a withdrawn subpoena, something that had shifted the public's understanding of what influence means and how far it should stretch, and perhaps the most interesting part was how many people who once dismissed the controversy began to return and watch more closely. The narrative had changed. This was no longer about gossip or drama, it was about fairness, balance, and consequences. And with creators rising not in anger but in purpose, the final chapters of this story seemed not yet written, because the subpoenas may be pulled, but the questions they raised were not going anywhere. Not now, and definitely not before full clarity was reached. But the storm didn't stop with the withdrawal of those subpoenas. In fact, that moment marked the point where the deeper unraveling began, because now people wanted answers, not statements, not rehearsed press blurbs, but raw, real, documented answers. What exactly were Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds hoping to find in those subpoenas? And more importantly, what were they trying to stop? And as legal analysts quietly pointed out, the timing of the withdrawal felt far from coincidental, because just days earlier, multiple creators had begun preparing filings of their own, not defensive responses, but offensive moves, transparency, petitions, requests for the court to unseal parts of the record, and even inquiries into whether the original subpoenas were part of a broader smear suppression effort rather than a legitimate case strategy. This wasn't just reactive. Any more creators were building coalitions, former rivals, and competing voices on YouTube began collaborating, appearing on each other's streams, exchanging legal notes, pooling resources in a way that turned fragmented reactions into something coordinated and powerful. And for the first time, the spotlight turned not just on Blake and Ryan as celebrities, but on the people surrounding them, the lawyers, the consultants, the firms and PR agents who had allegedly guided every step of the legal campaign. And some of those connections were beginning to raise serious eyebrows. One name in particular, a high-powered crisis manager who had worked with multiple Alistairs in the past, quietly disappeared from the team's known roster, fueling rumors that even insiders were distancing themselves from what had now become an escalating Morty seed PR nightmare. And then came the leaks, not tabloid rumors, but actual documentation, screenshots, email trails, internal memos suddenly appearing online in carefully redacted form. And what those documents suggested was that the subpoenas may have been less about gathering information for a legal defense and more about targeting creators who had been particularly effective in shaping the online narrative, creators who had gone viral with thoughtful breakdowns, timelines, and commentary were seemingly prioritized on a so-called watch list. And while nothing in the documents outright confirmed a smear campaign, the implications were heavy. It looked strategic, coordinated, and undeniably personal. Creators who were once afraid to speak began to find their voices again, not in rage, but in unity. Lawyers stepped in, offering pro bono help. Nonprofits released guides on subpoena responses, and more people outside of YouTube began to care. Journalists from mainstream outlets who had initially ignored the story started making quiet calls to sources asking what exactly had gone on behind the scenes. And then a bombshell, a motion filed by a legal watchdog organization asking the court to formally investigate the circumstances around the withdrawn subpoenas, citing potential misuse of legal tools to stifle protected speech. The motion didn't name Blake or Ryan directly, but everyone knew what it was referencing. And that's when the legal pressure began to swing back. The very tool used to try and quiet creators was now being used to question the motives of those who wielded it. Because in the eyes of the law, if subpoenas were issued for illegitimate reasons, that's not just bad optics. It could be a violation of legal ethics and a potential abuse of process. And if proven, it could bring sanctions, both financial and professional, on the lawyers involved. And while Blake and Ryan hadn't publicly commented on any of it, their silence became a story of its own. Their fan base split, some still loyal, others openly disappointed. Influencers who had once praised the couple for their wit And activism now hesitated, unsure of what to say and whether their support had been misplaced, and this silence became deafening when paired with a wave of digital actions. Creators quietly began uploading backup copies of their content, archiving messages, screenshots, and community posts in anticipation of what many felt was coming next. A legal pivot, a final desperate attempt to reassert control, but what they didn't expect was the cultural shift already in motion. Creators who had once been marginalized or mocked were now getting mainstream attention, podcast interviews, digital roundtables, even brief mentions on late-night segments, not mocking them, but questioning the power dynamics that had led to this moment. And for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning, not just legally, but socially. People were asking harder questions about the influence celebrities wield in the digital space and whether their fame gives them unfair power in conflicts with smaller independent voices. This wasn't just about Blake and Ryan anymore. This was about every creator who had ever been threatened for telling a story that didn't align with a celebrity's narrative. And with each day, more stories surfaced, not just about this case, but about others like it. The timing was too sharp to ignore. And for those watching closely, the pattern was clear. People were done being afraid, and those subpoenas may have been pulled, but they had already unleashed something bigger than anyone anticipated. And now, even if the legal fight ends, the reckoning had only just begun. So now, as the dust begins to settle and the echoes of pulled subpoenas still rattle through courtrooms and comment sections alike, there's one question on everyone's mind. Did Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds truly believe they could erase the internet's memory with legal pressure? Or did they never imagine their actions would provoke this kind of backlash? Because what started as a few creators raising eyebrows turned into a tidal wave of resistance that exposed more than just legal tactics. It revealed a growing distrust in the illusion of celebrity innocence, the curated personas, the polished apologies, the carefully timed PR moves. All of it began to feel hollow when placed against the raw, determined voices of those who refused to be silenced. And the irony is brutal. The very subpoenas meant to scare people into silence became the fuel that ignited mass solidarity. The creators they tried to isolate came together. The narratives they tried to suppress were amplified, and the questions they tried to dodge are now being shouted loud than ever. And while Blake and Ryan may have pulled the legal fire alarm hoping to extinguish the controversy, they accidentally set off a chain reaction that's now beyond their control, because people aren't just focused on what happened there, focused on what it means and what it says about power and speech and the line between influence and intimidation. This was never just about legal filings or YouTube drama. This was about visibility, about whose voices get to survive when powerful people feel threatened. And for once, the underdogs weren't just heard, they were believed. And now every creator who stood tall in the storm, every lawyer who volunteered their time, every viewer who asked the right questions, they've all become part of a bigger movement, one that won't vanish when the news cycle moves on. Because this case, this moment, it cracked something open. It reminded people that no one, no matter how famous, is above accountability, and that when truth becomes inconvenient for the powerful, it becomes even more urgent for the rest of us. And as new cases rise, as other celebrities watch from the sidelines, wondering if they too could be next, the warning is clear. Silence can't protect you if your actions have already spoken. And for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, their silence now screams louder than ever before, not just because of what they did or didn't say, but because of what they tried to bury and what the world chose to unearth instead. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful message in all of this came not from the court, but from the creators who looked at the mountain of influence before them and said, no, we will not bow, we will not break, we will not be erased, not today, not ever.